it's great to have you. And I wonder if you take this post from the president at face value. Do you really believe we could see a deal between the U.S. and Iran signed soon?
Well, great to be with you. Look, I certainly hope so. I think we've had a little bit of whiplash here, all of us, frankly. The reality is we've seen posts that are similar to this before. I think the way that it's framed, I think, is giving reason for optimism that probably is a bit more than most of us have had in the past. The fact that he called out the countries, the fact that he said it'll be very soon, there's some details and specificity here that we haven't seen. So look, do I think it's possible? I absolutely do. I also think, look, there is a not insignificant chance that the president is pushing for something that maybe the Iranians haven't even fully signed off on, or that he's trying to push them or coerce them into a corner in hopes that they will go along with it in the end. So I'm not ready to say it's quite done yet, but it's certainly reason for optimism.
Interesting. Jonathan, we think of you as an expert on the proxies. How important will it be for Hezbollah and for the Houthis to accept this? They're obviously not going to be at the negotiating table.
Yeah, that's right. Look, on the Houthi side, this entire war, I think one of the big questions has been why have the Houthis not gotten more involved? There's been significant conversations about the fact that they really have their own political agenda in Yemen, and this would have undermined it in some ways. The fact that the Saudis and the Houthis may have some agreements behind the scenes. I think the Houthis will be a little easier here, frankly, at least in the near term. Hezbollah is the really big question, and frankly, from that perspective, therefore, so is Israel. We know the Israelis have been unhappy with the deal of this contour simply because it was always supposed to seemingly relate to a ceasefire and the opening of the strait, and then maybe dealing with the nuclear program in a 60-day window, which almost have to be elongated. But if the ballistic missiles aren't dealt with, and Israel feels like it's going to be under threat because it's still a threat from Hezbollah for ballistic missiles, or it feels like the Hezbollah's activities, and especially if Iran starts to resupply Hezbollah in the future, Hezbollah constant attacks on the Israeli border, we already have seen that Israel is not always willing to listen when it comes to attacks on its border from President Trump trying to stop them. Israel went forward last week with a strike, obviously, that had repercussions. I think it's going to be an open question. I think it's a real question about where the proxies play into all of this.
Well, yeah, that certainly is one of the many questions that come to mind at this moment, Jonathan. But another one is did the U.S. going back to the military option actually work if it just unlocked potentially all parties agreeing to a deal? Was that Apache helicopter going down and the subsequent retaliatory strikes that the U.S. Conducted proof that the U.S. wasn't necessarily bluffing?
I think it certainly demonstrated that the U.S. wasn't bluffing. I do think that part is true. I think there's still a quite open question, though, of whether or not Iran actually cares all that much. The one thing we know is that Iran is willing to sacrifice an awful lot. Its economy, its people, its tolerance for pain, and its threshold for pain is significantly higher than traditionally we've had in the U.S., and that I think the U.S. is willing to support at this point, given if you look at where polling is, for example, on support of President Trump and this war. At the same time, clearly even the threats today were about being coercive, and coercive military strikes, not intended to bring us back potentially, if they had happened, to a full-scale war or what we saw through the March, but really about being strategic to try and keep upping the ante. I think clearly they've had some effect. I want to be clear that it's unlikely that it was the sole reason for Iran's decision to engage now. We know negotiations have been going on behind the scenes for quite a while, and I think it's probably a little bit of combination of both, frankly.
What do you think has happened since we all got up today here, Jonathan? We started the morning with great concern that we were about to go attack Iran and hit him even harder, as the president said, seize Karg Island, of course. By lunchtime, we're talking about a place and time to sign a peace deal. How did this come together, if you take the president at his words, in 5 hours when it didn't seem to work over the course of 5 weeks?
Yeah, my guess is I wouldn't look at it in a 5 hour time period. I think actually the weeks is more important. I think this is really a reflection of the fact that the negotiations were going on even as you had US strikes, even as you had
Okay.
Iranian retaliation over the last week or so. You still had the
I guess the
negotiations
question, though,
continue.
is was there a phone call this morning? Was there an exchange of messages, or is the president projecting?
No, I've got no doubt that there was some sort of engagement and exchange. I don't know
Mhm.
that whether it was direct or indirect. The Qataris have been playing an additional role. Obviously, the Pakistanis were still trying. I've got no doubt that there was a flurry of messages that have gone back and forth. But I also think those messages would have fallen, frankly, on deaf ears if the preparatory work hadn't been done over the last week or 2 weeks. And so I think you got to combine both of those to really understand how we probably got here today. But I've got no doubt Bloomberg will soon have a TikTok on it from your great reporting.
Oh, yeah, you can bet that our reporters are already hard at work trying to unearth what exactly happened here. Also, who exactly this deal was struck with? It's one thing for the two sides to be understood to be talking, but does it not matter who is actually doing the negotiating on the Iranian side? The president, Jonathan, says that this has been brought to the highest level of Iranian leadership and approved. Should we understand that to mean Mojtaba Khamenei, or is that IRGC leadership? How do we know that the leadership that approved this is one that's going to stand by it?
Yeah, it's a reflection of the fact that there's a bit of a void and a black hole when it comes to understanding how Iranian leadership decisions are being made fundamentally right now in Tehran. Look, the highest level would seem to indicate that that includes Moshtaba and the supreme leader. But really, what you're talking about right now, from everything I've heard and from people I've talked to, is that you really have a group of between kind of 6 and 8 people who are really leading in Tehran and who are coalescing and coordinating together to make decisions. It includes people like General Vahedi, the head of the guards. It includes people like Kalibaf, Speaker Kalibaf from the Majlis, a couple of others, the new national security advisors in that group. And so you would hope that it means all of them have come together and agreed. And this is the problem. If it turns out it's only one of them or two of them, Kalibaf has been the key interlocutor and negotiator between the U.S. And with the Pakistanis, then that will become a challenge. From the wording of the president's post, look, it would assume that it means Moshtaba, and that means the rest of them would have gotten together to sign off on it as well. I think time will tell, but it'll be pretty quick that we have a sense of whether this is real or not.
Okay, so let's say best case scenario, it is real. They meet somewhere. There's a signing ceremony. Iran knows, though, that it has leverage now that it may not have ever known before. How do you maintain an agreement like this, particularly when it comes to keeping the strait open?
I think one question is, what is the actual agreement? So the fundamental problem is, look,
Okay.
if this really is just the MOU to open the strait and then end the blockade, which is what seems to be implied, then you got a long way to go on all of the other key issues, right? The strait and the closure of the strait was not a problem that existed, frankly, before the conflict. There's two opportunities or possibilities, I should say. One is, look, the Europeans, the French, the Brits, have been leading a maritime effort to get together a group of like-minded countries to have some sort of force along the strait. There's questions about whether or not the Iranians will accept that, but that could be one way in the most immediate term that I know, having just been in Paris and speaking to French officials, can be deployed almost immediately once there's a ceasefire. The second part of this, though, is, look, you're probably going to have to keep a U.S. carrier group in the Gulf for some time. And this is going to be about a long-term threat proposition that if Iran threatens to close the strait again, or if they actually do use drones, for instance, to try to close the strait again and attack ships, then the U.S. is also in position, even independently of this broader force, to actually take action. And so you're going to need to maintain that sort of presence, which frankly is something I think President Trump has really not wanted to do if you look at the course of his
Right.
rhetoric earlier in the term.
Well, and that's also why he's called on other allies of the United States who are more reliant on the energy flowing out of the Strait of Hormuz to step up. Europe has seemed to suggest that once there was a resolution to the conflict, then they'd be willing to get together this coalition of the willing to help keep the strait open. But you're suggesting the U.S. is still going to have to be involved, Jonathan.
Yeah, look, I think the coalition of the willing absolutely can come in, and it can come in quite quickly. I'm confident of that. But I think that it's going to be very, very hard for the U.S. to say at that point, but we're just going to fully withdraw from the region. It's going to be delicate. And there's also a coercive nature here. Look, the nuclear program is still going to be unresolved. Issues related to ballistic missiles are still unresolved. Questions related to Iranian proxy networks are still going to be unresolved. In other words, if we're going to continue the negotiation, I think you'd want to keep that leverage, and you'd want to have it to ensure that European allies weren't alone in